We tend to think of plagues, these historical pandemics,
Mhm.
as just purely destructive,
Mhm.
like dark chapters all about suffering.
Right, that's the immediate image, devastation.
But what if they're actually something more? What if they act like these really harsh clarity agents?
Clarity agents, I mean.
Well, they don't just break things, they sort of expose the weaknesses that were already simmering under the surface. They
Mhm.
force us, collectively, to look at systemic problems we might otherwise just ignore.
That's a really interesting way to frame it.
Yeah.
Yeah, shifting from just the immediate impact to the longer term lessons, the patterns.
Exactly. When you look across history, you see these vulnerabilities popping up again and again.
Mhm.
Pandemics just seem to find them and make them worse.
They absolutely do.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive today. We're going to dig into some major historical pandemics using this fascinating material you shared, starting way back in ancient times, right up to, well, our very recent experiences. We want to understand how these huge health crises have consistently tangled with our food systems, with our immunity.
The connection is undeniable.
We're hunting for those key insights, those, maybe surprising links between what we eat, how our bodies fight back, and ultimately how stable our societies are. So where should we start? Where does this connection first really jump out?
Well, a logical place to begin is probably the plague of Athens, back around 430 BCE.
Okay, ancient Greece.
Yeah, and it's critical to remember this wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was during the Peloponnesian War.
Right, so the city was already under immense pressure.
Exactly. Athens was overcrowded. You had all these people fleeing the countryside, seeking refuge inside the city walls because of the war.
And that port, Piraeus, that was Athens' lifeline, wasn't it? For
Yeah.
food, supplies, everything.
Absolutely critical. It was the main way in, which of course makes it a potential single point of failure if something goes wrong.
So you've got overcrowding, maybe sanitation issues that come with that, and this one vital entry point.
It's a recipe for disaster, epidemiologically speaking, and the estimates are grim. Maybe a quarter of the population died.
Wow. And it's easy to think, okay, they had grain stored up, so they weren't like starving in the most basic sense.
Right. They had calories.
But the sources we looked at suggest something maybe more subtle was going on, like a lack of key nutrients, maybe vitamin C.
That's a fascinating theory, and it makes sense. A diet that's really heavy on grain, even if it provides energy, might be seriously lacking in micronutrients,
Like vitamin C.
especially vitamin C, which we now know is crucial for immune function. So even if they weren't starving for calories, a widespread sort of low-level vitamin C deficiency, well, that could have weakened the population's overall resistance.
So that might explain why Thucydides, the historian writing at the time, noted it seemed to hit people with weakened immune systems harder and why it lingered.
Precisely. It's not just about having enough food, it's about having the right food, the right balance of nutrients.
So the takeaway there isn't just overcrowding is bad, though it is. It's that even if your food supply seems okay calorie-wise, there can be hidden nutritional weaknesses.
Especially in stressed populations.
Yeah,
And it makes you think about our own complex global supply chains today, doesn't it? Are we really looking beyond just calories?
that's a really good point. And then on top of the biological vulnerability, you had the societal stuff kicking in. Thucydides talks about law and order breaking down, people abandoning religious customs, turning to superstition.
Total chaos. The plague acted like this intense pressure test, revealing not just the physical weaknesses, but the cracks in the social fabric, too.
That reliance on the single port, the risks of packing people tightly together without adequate sanitation.
It all became painfully clear. It's a foundational lesson, really, about overdependence and the need for robust infrastructure.
Okay, let's jump forward a bit to the Roman Empire, the Antonine Plague, starting around 165 CE.
Right. This one's generally thought to have been smallpox, maybe measles, brought back by soldiers returning from the East.
And again, it seems like it didn't hit a perfectly healthy, stable empire. There were underlying issues already.
That's right, pre-existing problems. Rome was already facing some food security challenges before the plague even arrived.
How so?
Well, there were droughts affecting the Nile region. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket, basically, so reduced grain harvests there were a big deal.
Okay.
And Mediterranean shipping, getting that grain and other goods around, was apparently becoming more dangerous, more precarious. So you might have had a population already dealing with some level of malnutrition or nutritional stress.
Right, okay, I see the setup. So a population potentially already a bit weakens nutritionally, and then this devastating disease sweeps through.
Exactly. And then the plague itself makes the food situation catastrophically worse.
How? Through labor shortages.
Massive labor shortages. The high death toll just decimated the agricultural workforce. Fewer people to farm meant fields went uncultivated, yields plummeted.
Which means scarcity, rising prices.
A vicious cycle. Disease leads to hunger. Hunger weakens people further, making them more susceptible to disease. And it wasn't just farming.
No.
The military lost huge numbers of soldiers, which weakened the borders. The whole economy suffered, production declined, trade routes were disrupted.
It's striking how similar the pattern feels to Athens, just on a much larger scale. That link between pre-existing food insecurity and pandemic impact.
And we'll see it again with the Black Death, too. It's a recurring theme.
And socially.
Yeah.
I remember reading about the persecution of Christians during this time.
Yes, that happened. They were scapegoated by some. But, somewhat ironically, Christianity also seems to have grown during this period, partly because Christians were noted for their willingness to care for the sick, even at great risk to themselves.
Wow. So the Antonine Plague really exposes the empire's vulnerabilities, reliance on faraway food, the fragility of urban centers when disease hits.
And it shows how these crises trigger complex social and political reactions. Everything is connected.
Okay, moving on again. The Plague of Justinian, mid-6th century.
Right. This is generally considered the first major documented pandemic caused by Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague bacterium, hitting the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire.
And Constantinople, the capital, was hit incredibly hard.
Devastatingly hard. Some ancient sources describe unbelievable mortality rates there. Hard to know exact numbers, but clearly catastrophic for the city.
And the impact on food. Let me guess. Labor shortages again.
You got it. Widespread deaths, particularly in the agricultural sector, disrupted farming, and crucially, it hit the grain supply from Egypt, which Constantinople depended on.
Leading to famines on top of the plague. Another huge, dense city reliant on external food facing a crisis.
It's a powerful pattern. And the economic fallout followed. Tax revenues dropped, inflation probably rose, social unrest.
And the military was weakened too.
Significantly, which led Justinian's empire to rely more heavily on mercenaries, bringing its own set of challenges and costs.
But there's a bit of nuance here now with newer research, isn't there? Suggesting maybe the impact outside the capital wasn't quite as universally apocalyptic as older histories thought.
That's true. More recent scholarship, looking at archaeological evidence and reevaluating texts, suggests that while Constantinople suffered immensely, the impact on agriculture and other towns across the empire might have been more patchy, more localized in some areas.
So maybe not a total collapse everywhere, but still.
But still, the fundamental vulnerability of that massive urban center, totally dependent on long-distance food and agricultural labor, was starkly revealed. That lesson holds.
Okay, now for the big one. The Black Death. Mid-14th century. Just the name evokes dread.
It was a demographic shock, unlike almost anything else in recorded history. Estimates vary, but maybe a third to a half of Europe's population perished in just a few years.
Unimaginable. But like the Antonine Plague, the stage was sort of set beforehand, wasn't it? Europe wasn't exactly thriving right before it hit.
That's a really critical point. You had what historians call a Malthusian crisis. Building up the population had grown, perhaps beyond what the medieval agricultural technology could reliably support long-term.
Straining resources.
Exactly. And then, just before the Black Death, you had the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, caused by terrible weather, widespread crop failures, starvation, and then, compounding that, a major disease outbreak in cattle, the Great Bovine Pestilence, wiping out draft animals needed for plowing.
So the population was already weakened by hunger, by malnutrition, before Yersinia pestis even arrived.
Significantly weakened.
Yeah.
Which undoubtedly made the plague's impact even more severe.
So the devastation was immense, but the aftermath, this is where it gets really fascinating, almost counterintuitive. It triggered huge societal changes.
Profound changes. Because so many people died, especially peasants and laborers, there was suddenly a massive labor shortage.
Supply and demand, but for people.
Exactly. The survivors found themselves in a position of unexpected power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions. Landlords were desperate for people to work their fields.
And this actually contributed to the end of serfdom in Western Europe.
It was a major factor, yeah. The old feudal obligations started to break down because the economic realities had just completely shifted. Land use changed too. More land was converted to pasture for sheep, which is less labor-intensive than growing grain.
And the diet, this part blows my mind, the diet of ordinary people actually improved after the Black Death.
It generally seems so, yes. With fewer mouths to feed and higher wages, surviving peasants could afford more varied foods. More meat, more dairy, more ale things that might have been occasional luxuries became more accessible.
So better nutrition for the survivors.
It appears so. And interestingly, this massive die-off seems to have temporarily reduced economic inequality. The gap between the rich and poor narrowed, at least for a while.
Did the nobility try to stop these changes?
Oh, absolutely. They tried things like the Statute of Laborers in England, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. They passed sumptuary laws dictating what peasants could wear or eat, trying to maintain the old social hierarchy.
But it didn't really work.
Largely, no. The economic tide had turned too strongly. You couldn't legislate away a massive labor shortage.
So the Black Death, horrific as it was, acted as this incredibly powerful, if brutal, socioeconomic reset. It reshaped agriculture, diets, labor relations, social structures.
Fundamentally, it's maybe the starkest example in history of a pandemic acting as a catalyst for massive transformative change.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The Columbian Exchange, starting after 1492. Not a single plague, but a whole different kind of biological event.
Right, a prolonged two-way exchange of plants, animals, diseases, technology, and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, the Americas.
And the disease aspect was catastrophic for the Americas.
Utterly catastrophic. Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, to which indigenous peoples had absolutely no prior exposure and therefore no immunity, just swept through.
The death tolls are staggering to even think about. Up to 90% mortality in some areas.
That's what the estimates suggest. Demographic collapse on an almost unimaginable scale. And this, of course, had a devastating impact on indigenous societies and their food systems.
How so, beyond just the loss of people?
Well, the massive depopulation meant loss of labor for farming, loss of traditional knowledge. Plus, the Europeans introduced their own crops and animals like cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, which often competed with or directly destroyed native crops and ecosystems. Traditional ways of managing the land were profoundly disrupted.
A complete upheaval. But the exchange went the other way too, didn't it, with food?
Oh, absolutely. And this is crucial. The New World gave the Old World crops that would fundamentally change diets, agriculture, and population trajectories across Afro-Eurasia.
We're talking potatoes, maize.
Potatoes, maize or corn, cassava, manioc, tomatoes, chili peppers, squash, beans, cacao. The list is long and incredibly important.
How did they have such a big impact?
Many of these crops were highly productive, adaptable to different climates and soils, and nutritionally valuable. Think about the potato in Northern Europe. It provided a cheap, reliable source of calories and nutrients, fueling population growth.
Or maize and cassava in Africa.
Exactly. They became staple foods in many regions, supporting larger populations, though sometimes leading to nutritional issues if diets became too reliant on just one staple.
So it was this massive two-way street. Devastating disease going one way, transformative crops going both ways.
It really highlights the immense, world-altering power of biological exchanges and the tragic consequences when novel pathogens meet immunologically naive populations.
Okay, let's move closer to our time. The Spanish flu, 1918-1920.
A very different kind of pandemic, an influenza virus, and unusually deadly, especially for young, healthy adults, which was quite different from typical flu patterns.
Right, that was one of the shocking things about it.
Yeah.
And did it interact with nutrition in specific ways?
It did, in a few interesting ways. There was concern at the time about the impact on nutrition during pregnancy and infancy. If mothers were severely ill, it could affect fetal development, and it disrupted breastfeeding.
Things with long-term consequences for health.
Exactly. And like other crises, it caused food shortages in some places. Public health advice often emphasized nutrient-rich foods for recovery, things like eggs, milk, broth. There was even this concept of invalid cookery, focused on making food appealing and digestible for the sick, maybe even pushing sugar for quick energy.
So definitely a recognition, even then, that nutrition mattered for recovery, even if the science was, still developing.
Right. And the societal disruption was huge, obviously.
Yeah.
Very familiar to us now. School closures, bans on public gatherings, overwhelmed hospitals, shortages of doctors and nurses.
Did anything positive come out of it, like reforms?
In some places, yes. It spurred public health reforms. The material mentioned Vermont as an example where it led to improvements. And it highlighted the importance of community responses, things like volunteer-run community kitchens popping up to feed the sick or families who couldn't cook.
So it showed the challenges of public health in a modern, interconnected society, but also the potential for community resilience and the beginnings of maybe more organized public health responses.
And it really drove home the potential for intergenerational impacts on health and nutrition.
Which brings us right up to COVID-19. And it feels like,
Yeah.
well, like we just reran many of these historical experiments, didn't we?
In so many ways, yes. It was like a harsh spotlight on the vulnerabilities of our modern system.
Especially the food system.
Absolutely. The supply chain disruptions were immediate and obvious. Empty shelves, logistical nightmares, labor shortages hit farms, processing plants, transportation.
Food prices went up, food insecurity increased.
Dramatically. And just like in history, the impact wasn't evenly distributed. Low-income countries, vulnerable populations within richer countries, they were hit much harder.
We saw worrying reports about rising childhood malnutrition in some parts of the world.
Yes. And perhaps paradoxically, increased consumption of ultra-processed foods, which are often cheap and shelf-stable but nutritionally poor. And we started seeing links between diets high in UPFs and worse COVID outcomes.
Right. And our habits changed too, didn't they? The explosion in online grocery shopping, for instance.
Huge shift. And it really underlined the critical importance of social safety nets, stimulus payments, food assistance programs in cushioning the blow for people.
It felt like a real-time stress test of globalization, particularly in food. Calls for more local, more resilient systems got louder.
Definitely. The fragility of relying on these long, complex, just-in-time chains became undeniable. And then there was the intense scientific focus on nutrition and immunity.
Suddenly, everyone was talking about vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, selenium.
Exactly. A massive research effort trying to understand how specific nutrients and overall nutritional status influence susceptibility to infection and the severity of the disease. It just powerfully reinforces that historical lesson. Nutrition is fundamental to resilience.
It really feels like COVID pulled all these historical threads together.
It did. And looking across all these examples, from Athens to COVID, you really start to see these common themes, these systemic failures that pandemics consistently expose and, frankly, accelerate.
Yeah, like malnutrition. It keeps coming up.
It's this double-edged sword, isn't it? Often it's there before the pandemic, weakening the population, making them more vulnerable. Think Athens, think pre-Black Death Europe.
Right.
And then the pandemic itself disrupts food production and distribution, causing more malnutrition.
Yeah.
And it forces us to realize that food security isn't just calories. It's about quality, micronutrients. The Athens vitamin C example is a good reminder of that.
Inequality, that seems like a constant.
A constant vulnerability multiplier. Every single time, the burden falls disproportionately on the poor, on marginalized communities.
Why is that? Is it housing, access to healthcare, baseline health?
It's all of those things. Poorer living conditions often mean higher exposure risk. Less access to quality food and healthcare means weaker baseline health and immune function. Fewer resources to cope with lockdowns or job losses. Inequality just makes populations fragile.
And then basic infrastructure failures. Bad sanitation, poor housing, weak food distribution networks.
These have been amplifiers throughout history. Think about crowded cities without proper sanitation during cholera outbreaks, or even way back with the plague of Athens. It shows that the pathogen's success often isn't just about the bug itself, but about the weaknesses in the host society systems: food, social structures, public health.
Which brings us to this really crucial intersection. Nutrition, the environment we live in, and how pandemics play out. It's all woven together.
Incredibly so. And we understand the nutritional part much better now at the molecular level. We know vitamin D is vital for immune cell function. Vitamin C is a key antioxidant and supports various immune processes. Zinc is crucial for immune cell development and communication.
Selenium, protein for antibodies, iron, they all have specific jobs.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that the fields of nutrigenomics and epigenetics. It's not just about nutrients in general, it's about how our specific genes interact with our diet and environment.
Okay, break that down a bit. Nutrigenomics is food affecting genes. Nutrigenics is genes affecting our response to food.
Broadly, yes. And epigenetics adds another layer. It's like the software that runs on our genetic hardware. Diet and other environmental factors can change epigenetic markers, effectively turning genes on or off without altering the DNA sequence itself. These changes can even be passed down generations.
Wow. So our diet can literally talk to our genes.
In a very real sense. And when
Yeah.
you look at variations, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms in specific genes, you see how they can influence our individual needs and responses.
Like MTHFR. I hear about that one a lot.
Right. Variations in MTHFR affect how well we process folate, which is crucial for methylation, a fundamental biochemical process. And poor methylation can have knock-on effects on, well, almost everything, including immune function, detoxification, even neurotransmitter balance. It might indirectly affect histamine levels or iron handling, too.
Okay. And APOE, that's linked to Alzheimer's, but also diet.
Yes, particularly the APOE04 variant. It affects cholesterol metabolism, and people with APO4 seem to be more sensitive to the negative effects of high saturated fat intake. There's also evidence it might affect iron balance in the brain.
FTO, that's the obesity gene.
It's strongly associated with obesity risk and appetite regulation, yeah. But interestingly, research suggests that the response to things like high-protein diets for weight loss might differ depending on your FTO genetics.
So your genes influence how well a diet might work for you.
Potentially, yes. Others, like COMT, affect neurotransmitter breakdown and rely on methylation. HLA genes are famous for their link to celiac disease risk with gluten. DAO and HNMT gene variations can affect histamine breakdown, leading to intolerance. GST genes influence detoxification pathways. The list goes on.
It's incredibly complex, but the message is, our individual biology interacts with our food in unique ways.
Exactly. And dietary compounds, especially from plants, phytochemicals, can directly influence our epigenome, potentially promoting healthier gene expression patterns.
Which makes the contrast between ancestral diets and our modern Western diet even starker.
Absolutely. Think about what ancestral diets generally looked like based on anthropological evidence. Huge diversity of plants and animals, whole foods, tons of fiber, rich in micronutrients and phytochemicals. Probably periods of intermittent fasting, too, just due to availability.
And then came the agricultural revolution.
Which was a double-edged sword. It allowed for larger populations, yes, but often led to narrower diets, heavily reliant on a few staple grains.
Less diversity.
Less diversity, and often more anti-nutrients like phytates from grains that can block mineral absorption. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural societies often shows signs of declining health compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors: reduced stature, more cavities, signs of anemia, enamel defects.
So agriculture wasn't an automatic step up in terms of individual health.
Not necessarily. Depending on the staple crop, you could see specific deficiencies like niacin with maize or protein and vitamin A with rice. And the regular supply of food meant less intermittent fasting,
And then came the Industrial Revolution and the modern Western diet.
which took things much further. Ultra-processed foods now dominate in many places, high in refined carbs, unhealthy fats, sugar, salt, strip of fiber, micronutrients, and those beneficial phytochemicals,
And this diet is strongly linked to chronic inflammation.
which underpins so many chronic diseases and is terrible for immune function. Modern agriculture and food processing often select for yield and shelf life over nutrient density, further reducing phytochemical content.
So this is the gene-diet mismatch idea. Our genes are still adapted for that ancestral way of eating, and this rapid shift is causing problems.
That's the core theory. Our biology just hasn't caught up with the speed of dietary change, leading to chronic disease and potentially impairing our resilience to acute threats like infections.
And where does the gut microbiome fit into all this?
It's absolutely central. It's like this critical mediator between our diet and our health.
There are gut bugs.
Trillions of them. And their composition is profoundly shaped by what we eat. Ancestral-type diets, rich in fiber and diverse plant foods, tend to support a much more diverse and beneficial microbiome compared to a low-fiber, high-processed food diet.
And this diversity matters for immunity.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Our microbiome helps train our immune system from birth. It regulates immune responses, helps maintain the gut barrier, and produces beneficial compounds, postbiotics, like short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate.
Butyrate is anti-inflammatory, right?
Very much so. It fuels gut cells and helps calm inflammation. A modern diet, plus things like antibiotics and maybe our overly sanitized environment, can disrupt this balance, leading to dysbiosis, an unhealthy microbial state, which is linked to inflammation and impaired immunity.
It's like a whole ecosystem inside us that's under threat.
It really is. There's even a field called paleomicrobiology trying to reconstruct ancient gut microbiomes from archaeological samples. And while diet is key, our own host genetics also play a role in shaping our microbiome composition.
So it's this causal chain. Bad diet leads to bad gut bugs, leads to inflammation and metabolic problems, leads to weaker immunity, makes us more vulnerable to pandemics.
That's a simplified but essentially accurate picture of how it's interconnected.
And thinking back historically, urbanization and trade routes were key factors too, right? Just
Yeah.
bringing people and pathogens together.
Definitely. Cities, especially before modern sanitation, were hotspots for disease. And trade routes were the highways for pathogens. Think of the Silk Road and the Black Death, or Mediterranean shipping in the earlier plagues.
Even before cities and agriculture. I remember reading about Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, fascinating site. Large gatherings of hunter-gatherers building monumental structures long before farming. It raises questions about whether large-scale congregations, even without agriculture, could have created new dynamics for disease transmission. Their diet would have been purely hunter-gatherer, rich and diverse.
So density and movement have always played a role. But it's not all doom and gloom. Humans have also been incredibly adaptive.
That's the flip side, and it's crucial. We've developed amazing cultural adaptations and resilience strategies over millennia, especially around food.
Like food processing and preservation. That's not just about making food last, is it?
Often not. Many traditional methods actually enhance nutritional value or digestibility. Fermentation is a prime example.
Sourdough bread.
Perfect example. The long fermentation breaks down phytates, making minerals like iron and zinc more available. It predigests gluten, making it easier on the gut for some people, lowers the glycemic index, and acts as a natural preservative.
And things like tas, kimchi, sauerkraut.
All packed with probiotics, often B vitamins, maybe other beneficial compounds depending on the ingredients. Traditional African fermented porridges and beverages from sorghum or millet, detoxification of cassava through fermentation. These are ancient technologies vital for gut health and nutrient supply.
Even Roman fish sauce, garum.
A fermented product providing umami and likely some nutrients traded across the empire. Or fermented breadfruit or poi from taro in the Pacific ways to create stable food reserves.
And then simple drying, salting, smoking.
Incredibly effective. Think of Viking stockfish, air-dried cod, super high in protein, lasts forever, became a major trade commodity.
Or pemmican from indigenous North Americans.
Dried meat, rendered fat, berries, incredibly nutrient-dense, calorie-dense, perfect survival food that keeps for ages. Salting and smoking work by drawing out moisture and adding antimicrobial compounds.
And they also figured out how to deal with anti-nutrients in plants. Right?
Yes. Soaking, sprouting, fermenting these techniques were likely discovered empirically and are brilliant ways to reduce things like phytates, lectins, tannins, enzyme inhibitors, even oxalates in some cases.
Soaking beans, sprouting grains.
Exactly. Fermenting soy reduces phytates. Proper preparation of quinoa removes saponins. Traditional methods for cassava and taro detoxification are essential to make them safe and edible. It's sophisticated food chemistry passed down through generations.
Plus clever storage, like root cellars and granaries.
Essential for managing harvests and surviving lean periods. Root cellars provide cool, humid conditions. Granaries and storage pits protected grains and tubers from moisture and pests. You see amazing examples from ancient cultures worldwide.
Beyond food tech, were there cultural practices specifically responding to plagues?
Yes. Fasting often had a religious motivation, but was a common response. Quarantine and isolation have ancient roots and were famously formalized during the Black Death in ports like Venice and Ragusa, and used again during the Spanish flu.
And herbal medicine.
Absolutely. People turned to what they knew. During the Black Death, aromatic herbs and vinegar were widely used, maybe as fumigants or perceived protectants. Native American traditions used plants like the pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea, against smallpox. During the Spanish flu, folk remedies involving onions or specific herbs like gelsemium or eupatorium were common.
So a deep well of traditional knowledge and practice. And plagues also forced bigger societal changes.
We touched on this with the Black Death, massive shifts in labor, land use, the decline of serfdom in the West. Interestingly, some argue later plagues had less socioeconomic impact because institutions like entailed land ownership, fidia commissum, prevented the same kind of land redistribution.
And public health as a field really grew out of epidemics, didn't it?
Largely, yes. The devastating cholera, typhoid, and TB outbreaks in 19th century industrial cities spurred major sanitation reforms, clean water initiatives, and the beginnings of organized public health governance. The Spanish flu also led to reforms and better organization in some areas.
And we see echoes today with interest in decentralization, community food projects.
Exactly. Emergency kitchens during the Spanish flu have modern parallels in the rise of urban agriculture, CSAs, farmers markets, and movements like indigenous food sovereignty, all seeking more local control and resilience.
So bringing it all together, plagues really are these brutal but effective clarity agents. They just magnify the fault lines that are already there.
Precisely. They show up the risks of over-centralized, fragile food systems, whether historical reliance on Egyptian grain or modern global supply chains.
They reveal nutritional deficiencies hidden beneath apparent abundance, like our modern diet, rich in calories but poor in nutrients, or historical diets limited in variety.
They highlight the danger of losing traditional food skills and local ecological knowledge. And they underscore how environmental degradation, like the kind associated with industrial agriculture, can increase risks, for instance, through habitat destruction, driving zoonotic disease emergence.
So the path forward involves building what you called systemic immunity.
Yeah, it's this idea that individual health is inseparable from the health of the community and the environment. It means moving towards food systems that support all three.
Like lower input systems.
Yeah.
More local, regional.
Exactly. Systems based on agroecological principles, reducing reliance on external inputs like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, focusing on soil health, biodiversity, supporting food sovereignty, the right of communities to control their own food systems, ensuring culturally appropriate food produced through ecological methods.
And valuing that ancestral and traditional wisdom we talked about. Fermentation, sprouting, using local resources smartly.
Integrating that wisdom with the best of modern science seems key.
So what does building better look like, practically?
It means strengthening holistic public health, focusing on prevention, boosting nutrition literacy, addressing the social determinants of health.
Promoting nutritional resilience, encouraging diverse whole food diets, ensuring equitable access, maybe exploring personalized nutrition carefully within that whole food framework.
Fostering food systems that are adaptable, equitable, and decentralized. That means supporting local networks, small-scale agroecology, diversifying crops and supply chains, making sure vulnerable communities have access.
And embedding ecological thinking into policy.
Absolutely. Policies that support sustainable agriculture, protect biodiversity, build soil health, conserve water, and mitigate climate change are fundamental to long-term resilience.
It sounds like a synthesis. Ancient wisdom meets modern science, meets ecological understanding.
That's the goal. You can see the causal chain for building resilience. Invest in local, sustainable food production, plus integrate traditional knowledge, plus prioritize public health nutrition, plus ensure equity leads to better community food security, stronger individual immune resilience, environmental benefits, and social justice, which ultimately means reduced vulnerability to pandemics and other shocks. Diversity is key at every level.
So, yeah, plagues are incredibly disruptive, but that clarity they provide about our weak spots, especially around food and immunity, is invaluable.
It is, and that historical lesson just keeps repeating. Nutrition and resilience are fundamentally linked.
It really feels like this whole deep dive points towards needing a shift, moving beyond just reacting to the latest crisis, and instead getting serious about proactively building systems that are more robust, more equitable, and frankly, more in tune with ecological reality.
Well said. True resilience isn't about building impenetrable walls against every threat. It's about fostering systems, biological, social, ecological, that are inherently more adaptable, diverse, and capable of learning and regenerating.
Leaves you thinking, doesn't it? That real lasting resilience comes from weaving together the wisdom of the past with our current knowledge to forge a healthier future. It's about moving from these cycles of disruption to hopefully lasting positive transformation. And it really makes you think about the role food plays the food on our own plates in that much bigger picture of collective health and preparedness.